In this presentation, we shall be looking at how the concern for maqasid helps scholars when dealing with situations where people are in some form of necessity, and the safety net principles we discussed earlier on, Saddud Daraya, that is blocking the means to harm, or Fathud Daraya, also opening means to benefit, sometimes referred to or more often referred to as istihsan, juristic preference for benefit or achieving of maqasid, and also concern for maslaha, public interest. We look at how scholars use these tools for people who are going through certain levels of hardship or difficulty. There's a maxim scholars respect, which is that with change in circumstance comes change in fatwa. Fatwa, as we've said before, is more like a doctor's prescription to a specific patient's problems. Because a fatwa is given to one person doesn't mean it is the fatwa to everybody. And here it is important, as we will look again in more detail later, to distinguish between fatwa and a hukum. The hukum is the normative ruling of Sharia on a particular issue. Fatwa usually is more a response to context. Hukum usually is based on what does the Quran or the Sunnah say on a particular issue. So alcohol, for example, is haram. That is the hukum on alcohol. But there could be a fatwa on alcohol for a person in a dire situation that makes it mubah, permissible, or even mustahab, encouraged. The hukum or Islam's position on marriage is mustahab, or what some would call sunnah. It is encouraged. It's not compulsory, but it is encouraged. It's a rewarding act. But for some people, for whatever reason, a fatwa may be given that it is haram for somebody to get married because he has a particular type of disease that may hurt other people. He cannot fulfill the rights of the wife, or he is hiding some information that she has a right to know. So the key point here is to distinguish between the hukum, which is the normal ruling on an issue, and a fatwa, which is a specific ruling considering the context of the person involved. The use of istihsan and saddud dhariya and maslaha, these are used not to create hukum, but usually to create fatwa. These, therefore, are not permanent judgments, but only judgments on a particular issue for a period and for a place and context where the judgment helps the attainment of the maqasid or the objectives of Sharia. This is why it's a bit dangerous to quickly rush and criticize scholars who give fatwa that go contrary to the hukum. The jurist is usually qualified in knowing when is the context different from the context that the hukum, the normative judgment on an issue, applies. So under normal circumstances, the hukum is what applies. But it is the mufti or the mujtahid who knows when a fatwa would be required, and that fatwa may not coincide with the hukum because the context has changed. In giving licenses or allowances or concessions for people in necessity, scholars remember, of course, and bear in mind that Sharia requires that people in difficulty, al-mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir, hardship begets facility, and ad-darar yuzal, that hardship should be eliminated. When it then comes to helping people in difficult situations, you have the scholars classifying situations into 2 or 3 categories based on the level of difficulty people find themselves, by looking at what exactly is threatened. So by looking at the level of necessity, they would describe a situation as either being in darura, in other words, a person is in dire necessity. that is the daruriyat, those essentials of survival are threatened, or a person is in a situation of haja, that means the hajiyat have been threatened, or a person is in a situation of tahsini, where they are comfortable and nothing really is threatened that they cannot manage without. So they will look at the situation and grade situations of hardship according to whether people are in haja situation or the more severe darura situation. They would also distinguish between the things that are prohibited, that are to be allowed because people are in difficulties. And so they would distinguish between those things that are haram in and of themselves. They are the mafsada that Sharia is trying to avoid. They are the maqasid, those specific objectives Sharia is trying to avoid. Or that they are haram of the means. In other words, these are haram because they lead to the actual prohibitions. So when we look therefore at situations and we say you've got situations of darura and haja and tahsini, what we need to remember is these are not clear demarcated categories. There's overlapping in these categories, and sometimes therefore scholars would differ in their assessment of whether a person is in a haja or whether they are in darura. But it is better for people to err on the side of caution, of compassion for people who are going through difficulties. When it comes to the difference between haram of the ends and haram of the means, so you find zina, for example, is considered by some scholars as being a haram of the ends. Things that lead to zina, like a man and a woman being alone without a chaperone in a closed place, would be haram of the means. Hugging each other would be haram of the means. Exposing their aura or privacy to each other would be haram of the means, because these are means that lead to the final ends that Sharia is trying to avoid. However, just as with the darura and haja, where you have overlap, you do have differences of opinion among scholars regarding whether a particular haram is a haram of the end or whether it is haram of the means. So the point here is you will have differences among scholars in their assessment of the situation. And so when things are haram, what you have is a gradation from the makruh, which is not haram, but it is disliked, it is undesirable, though tolerated, to haram of the means, to the greater worse types of haram, which are haram of the ends. The greater the difficulty somebody finds himself in, the greater the allowances scholars are ready to give. So the more severe the hardship scholars find individuals in or facing or societies confronting, the more the types of haram that the scholars are ready to concede as permissible under those circumstances. So as a general rule, the more the hardship, the more the leniency, the more the quality and the quantity of allowances. Why? Because hardship begets facility, and the greater the hardship, the more the concessions that need to be made to take people out of their dire situations.